Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Andre, for the introduction. And thank you for making it so late in the day, in a busy day here. So as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from London. I do talk a little bit quickly, so you'll have to bear with me. There's not too many people here, so if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt the presentation. I know you guys don't really like interrupting the presentation, but feel free to. I'm quite clumsy with the demo anyway, so I'll probably make quite a few mistakes. But feel free to ask any questions that you've got. The plan that I've got, seeing as I have your attention and you've made it to the session. Oh. So yeah, I'll quickly go back one slide in a minute. So the plan is hopefully I'll have your attention for an hour if I don't put you, or just over 1 hour, providing I don't put you to sleep before then. So I'm just going to quickly cover what Fortinet see from a DDoS perspective from our customers. Then I'll go into the FortiDDoS solution, and then performance is quite a key thing for us. We do very well with our platforms, so I'll cover that. And then hopefully, time permitting, I'll be able to do a demo as well. We have some remote facilities set up in our France Ssl lab, so we can actually, I mean, hopefully we'll have time to demo it today, but what you're going to see today is available and ready to be demoed by any Fortinet employee at any time, really, or certainly a Fortinet systems engineer. So, sorry, I just had my slides mixed up. So just to kind of go back one slide, FortiDDoS sits within the Fortinet portfolio within the application side of the product range. So obviously we have the FortiGate firewall, we have the FortiManager, we have the FortiAnalyzer. They're kind of Fortinet's heartbeat, the core products. They sit in the center. They're a very vital part of our portfolio. But Fortinet is a security company, and we have a product range that goes from the access layer. So we're talking about Wi-Fi, we're talking about switching, 802.1x, having a radius server, being able to do two-factor authentication. We have solutions that start from the access layer, they cover the firewall, and they go all the way through to the application side of the network, where we look at ADCs, web application firewalls, and the DDoS. So the DDoS technology itself, sometimes we hear customers say that actually, is it a subcomponent of the FortiGate? Have you just taken, a clever bit of the FortiGate and actually made that into its own product? So the simple answer to that is no. The DDoS solution that Fortinet have was actually an acquisition. So it was a company called IntruGuard. So I actually only found this out last month, actually, when I was speaking to the developers. I was the development team's based out in Sunnyvale, so I went to see them. And IntruGuard's first official actual customer was Checkpoint. So when they were actually IntruGuard themselves, their first actually paying customer that they ever had was actually Checkpoint. And so that was quite interesting to know. They worked with Checkpoint in the when Checkpoint acquired Zone Labs and Zone Alarm, when the policy updates were getting too heavy because Checkpoint wasn't used to that level of throughput from that many consumers, that they actually worked with IntruGuard to actually deliver that solution. So Fortinet acquired IntruGuard, I think, in Q1 of 2012. So the IntruGuard itself was a behavioral-based and anomaly-based DDoS system. And after the acquisition, the technology has now moved on to Fortinet ASICs. So the core product is still the same, but the GUI, the CLI is a lot more something out of the Fortinet portfolio. So it used to have its own hardware platform, its own GUI, its own central management platform, et cetera, et cetera. The core technology is still the same, so we haven't mixed it with FortiOS or done anything like that, but it has a FortiOS CLI. We've kind of overlaid the existing CLI with the FortiOS, just so that it's common with the other platforms. And the GUI, even though it isn't like a FortiGate, if those of you who used to or worked with our ADC products, it's very similar to that. So the product now, even though we acquired it 2 years ago, has truly been actually merged into the Fortinet portfolio. But the core technology is still the same. It's been developed, it's been added on, but it's not a case of we actually bought IntruGuard and actually merged that into FortiOS. In fact, it was the other way around. We had IntruGuard and we took the best management components out of FortiGate and actually put that into the FortiDDoS. Okay, so from a news perspective, a bit of a marketing slide, but really what I use this for is just to kind of highlight a very important point in regards to, when it comes to DDoS, one of the things that we hear a lot on the news is the very big attacks, the 100 gig, the 200 gig, the 300 gig attacks. And to an extent, it's quite ironic, I'm saying this in front of a cinema screen, there's a bit of a Hollywood effect to it. When you hear of a 300 gig or 400 gig attack, first of all, as security customers, as engineers, you kind of think, okay, well, no, that's something really dangerous. But then also kind of distance yourself from it. Unless you work with a service provider in the core of the network, those type of numbers aren't really that real to you. So if someone actually says, okay, there was with the spam house, there was the 300 gig attack. We have the DNS amplifications attacks that can go up to 400 gig. When you hear those type of numbers, you think, well, okay, that's not really relevant to me. It's bad, it's scary, the service providers are getting hit by it, but it's not really that dangerous. Okay, 400 gig, me as a customer or me as a partner, my customers don't actually have that type of bandwidth, so DDoS is kind of something a little bit removed from me. The reality is, that's the stuff that kind of hits the news, and that's the stuff that kind of has the Hollywood wow factor to it that makes you, look up and actually take notice of it. The reality is, and we see this from our own customers as well, that the majority of attacks, if you look at bullet point number 3, which is probably the only interesting bit there, is, if you look at bullet point number 3, the majority of the attacks that are actually effective are very low bandwidth. You're looking at attacks that are less than 100 meg, okay? The majority of successful DDoS attacks are up to 50 megabits per second in bandwidth. So they're not these massive numbers that we see in the news or in the headlines of 300 gig, 400 gig. The actual successful attacks are very small. And like I said, hopefully when we get to actually do the demo, I'll actually show you how with a layer 7 HTTP attack, you can actually bring a web server down with about 300 kilobits worth of traffic. So you don't even need 50 meg. With just a few kilobits worth of traffic, if you know what you're going to expose at layer 7 with HTTP, I mean, admittedly, it's a relatively weak web server in the lab, so it's not really going to defend itself too much. But the demo that we actually have set up in the lab and all the tools that we use in our own labs is nothing made by Fortinet. So obviously the FortiDDoS solution itself is our own product, but all the tools that we use for attacking are pretty much less what any attacker would use. The only thing that we use slightly different from what hackers would use is that obviously we have very extensive test centers. So we have Spirent and Ixias. We have very strong performance testing machines that we actually use for the test. But from what we've seen, the most effective attacks don't need 100 gig, 200 gig. They only need a very small level of bandwidth. Okay, and how can you actually do that? Is by actually targeting the upper layers, the higher layers of the network application layer and working with the attack at layer 7. So the FortiDDoS solution itself covers, protects DDoS at layer 3, layer 4, and layer 7. Okay, so to understand the different types of attacks, I'll go through this quite quickly. I'm sure you guys are going to get a copy of these slides, so a few of these slides kind of break down slowly, but I'll move through it quite quickly to get to the demo. So when in broad terms, if you're generally talking about DDoS, then when we're talking about a bulk volumetric attack, that is the very large attack. We're talking about a large volume of traffic, and normally that's to do with SYN floods. So even though SYN flood is a bit of an old, tired subject, our two biggest wins of last quarter were two ISPs that were getting hammered by SYN floods. There were actually two ISPs that were in Eastern Europe, so they're in slightly volatile geographies. And for political reasons, the service provider is actually getting targeted. And even though SYN floods, which is something that's considered quite old, it should be protected against in the DDoS world, for these two service providers that we worked with, it was a very real problem for them. Okay, and they tested pretty much less everybody on the marketplace, and we done very well with that. The other type of DDoS attack, and this is the one that I mentioned on the previous slide, is the one that doesn't necessarily use up a lot of bandwidth. We're not talking about even 100 meg, less than 100 meg. If you target the right application with the right packet type, you can actually do a lot of damage. Okay? And the third type of DDoS attack, so with cloud, what we mean by that in the Fortinet and the FortiDDoS world, this is really the hosting environments. So we work with a lot of service providers. So the solution itself is really more geared for enterprises, but because of the high performance and bandwidth capability, we do see it being deployed in the service providers as well. So we have a lot of service providers that actually say, look, I have a hosted environment where I host rack space, I host servers, I host applications, but I've got zero visibility. And my two biggest concerns are, because this is a very open hosting environment, well, the first thing I'm concerned about is someone actually launching an attack from the hosting environment out to the internet. So I'm selling a service, someone buys the virtual server, the physical server, whatever. They buy an application server that's hosted in my data center. What I'm very worried about is if those guys actually are compromised and then they're used as a botnet to actually launch an attack, be it low bandwidth or high bandwidth. What's an even bigger concern for the service provider, for the hosting customers, is if one of their customers is compromised in the data center, that customer is then used to launch an attack on another customer. So that actually even worries them more than a customer being compromised internally and being used to, as a source of an attack out on the internet. Because it affects the SLAs, it has money, it has reputation implications, what the hosting environment partners and service providers are very worried about is if one customer is compromised and then they're used as a source of DDoS to attack another customer within the data center. That's very dangerous for them. So the FortiDDoS, I'll explain where it actually kind of sits when it comes to these different DDoS types. But we do have a very focused place of deployment. We don't necessarily say yes to every type of deployment. So I'll go through over the next few slides, where our limitations are and what our ideal positioning is. So to look at each one of those three layers in a little bit more detail, what are we talking about when we're talking about bulk volumetric attacks? Like I said, this is the SYN flood. This is a port flood. This is an anomalous packet, is a bad-looking packet. So this is the type of stuff that, although it doesn't stress firewalls, with the right type of volume, it could actually start affecting your firewall's performance. Okay, unless your firewalls, so even though the FortiGates, and we'll talk about the difference between a FortiDDoS and a FortiGate, are capable of actually handling SYN floods and UDP attacks and anomalous packets, there are things that the FortiDDoS does a lot better than your traditional firewall would do. So the layer 7 attack, so what do we talk about when we talk about layer 7 attacks? This is a type of attack that will actually work not with the number of SYNs or targeting a specific port. It's actually, it understands that within this application, within HTTP, for example, there's a weakness with this type of packet, and it's going to keep repeating that type of packet. Okay? So the FortiDDoS today has what we refer to as 3 protocol decoders. So 3 applications that we fully understand at layer 7 is HTTP, SIP, and DNS. Okay? So you would say, well, what about SMTP? Okay, we're TCP port 25. How the FortiDDoS handle that? So it recognizes something like SMTP from a IP port and protocol perspective. Okay, so rate-based, it's an anomalous DDoS detection system. Okay, at layer 7, we understand the low-level attributes for HTTP, for SIP, and for DNS. So I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. And one of the most destructive attacks that we've seen today out on the internet when it comes to HTTP is something called slow loris. Okay, and that's the attack. I mean, you can download it from pretty much any hacking forum on the internet. If you have a standard Apache web server with very little security protection inbuilt to it, a slow loris attack can actually bring that web server down within 20 seconds with less than 300 kilobytes worth of traffic. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to generate enough traffic to actually build up like 100 meg or 200 meg or even a gigabit's worth of DOS traffic and aim that towards the server. Just with a very, with the right application attack, okay, you only need a small amount of packets to actually launch that, to have a successful attack. So when it comes to DDoS, what options do you have for protection? So one of the first options that you actually have is the cloud-based protection. So in all honesty, this is the easiest thing to do. And about 2 years ago, about 2 years ago, I was at another vendor, but I was working with DDoS. And we lost a lot of business to the cloud-based DDoS providers. Okay, because the reason for that was DDoS, it wasn't a new subject, but 2 years ago, there was a heightened level of attacks. And what we actually found was that with a lot of companies, be they banks, service providers, retail organizations, whatever, it actually turned up on their security agenda. So they actually had budget and they had to do something to actually get that DDoS tick box ticked. And what we actually found was that even though some companies really liked the fact that they liked a DDoS technology and they wanted to buy a specific DDoS technology, they would have to then engineer a solution, own that solution, and bring it into the network. Okay? Because DDoS is still quite a new subject, it wasn't as well known as IPS, AV, firewalling. There was no real control or system or standard engineered solution for the enterprise customers, it was much easier for them to actually go with the cloud-based solution. They said, okay, look, I don't really like the cloud-based solution, but it's easy. Okay, I'll pay somebody a monthly subscription fee. Okay, I don't have to put anything on my network. Okay, so there's nothing going to drop the traffic. Those guys own the SLA. Okay, if they they'll just put an analyzer on the network. If their analyzer detects an attack, then they'll redirect my traffic into the cloud, into the service provider, and they can mitigate it from there. So that was kind of the de facto direction a lot of customers went in. What they actually realized now after a couple of years, or after 2.5 years now, was that it was a very expensive insurance policy. Because with the cloud-based providers, you actually pay a monthly fee, at a premium. So with some providers, they can charge up to $20,000 a month. And it's basically just an insurance policy. So on your premises, you would have a flow collector. And that flow collector, if it didn't detect an attack, would never redirect the traffic into the cloud. So if you'd been running this solution for a number of years and you'd never detected or you'd never been a target of DDoS, you're paying a lot of money to actually then just have a kind of insurance policy for DDoS. But I mean, one of the things, admittedly, a cloud-based solution does very well is that it prevents the internet connection from being saturated. Okay, if your internet connection is, you're a customer, you have your internet connection, if that's going to reach its maximum bandwidth, then the cloud-based service can actually detect that and then redirect the traffic to actually be cleaned. Okay, but these solutions do come at a premium. I'll cover this in the next slide as well, but a lot of customers actually said, well, look, we have a FortiGate. A FortiGate is a very powerful firewall. Okay, it has complex content processors, it has complex network processors. It can do a lot of packets per second. Okay, if I have something on the network that's so powerful, and by what you're saying is that when it comes to DDoS, you need to be able to handle the large volume of traffic. But as long as you've got the awareness with the attacks that come with a smaller number of packets, then as long as my processor is aware of it, I should be able to catch it. So why can't I use a FortiGate? So I'll cover that in a little bit more detail. So the FortiGate does actually have DOS policies on there. And if you're looking at some of the newer D platforms, they actually do a lot of the SYN protection actually in the ASIC itself. So they can actually do a lot of this, but there is a distinct limitation with what they can actually achieve when it comes to DDoS protection. So I'll cover that in the next slide. So if you want to protect yourself against DDoS, the third option that you've actually got then is actually having a dedicated appliance. A lot of the DDoS appliances that we look at today are signature-based. The FortiDDoS isn't signature-based. Okay, so just to step back slightly. So a lot of customers, this is if you guys were to ever discuss this option with the customer, if it was an existing FortiGate customer and they had one of the more powerful platforms, the first question they'd have is, why can't I just use that? Okay, I have a platform that's 10 gig, 20 gig, 30 gig capable. I'm only using a very, very small amount of that capacity. Why would I actually then want something else to protect me against DDoS? Okay, if I've got an ASIC that I can do all the SYN protection in, why would I actually want to buy anything else? So there's three clear reasons or three clear differentiators between the FortiDDoS and the FortiGate. Okay, so when it actually comes to your configuring your DDoS options, or what we refer to as thresholds, with a firewall, there's no guidance. For those of you who have ever deployed a firewall and tried to get it to do some SYN protection, or any type of layer 7 DDoS type protection, one of the things you'll acknowledge or hopefully appreciate or at least agree with me is that there's not normally any guidance given. Okay, if the customer says to you, okay, look, I want you to put this firewall in front of my web server and make sure the web server isn't going to get hit by a denial of service. Okay, so let's take SYNs for an example. On a FortiGate, you can actually configure how many SYNs per second that web server can handle. Okay, but when it actually comes to actually getting a good number or a value actually there in that configuration, you normally don't get any guidance. Normally you go to the application guys or you go to the web server guys and they say, oh, okay, that web server, what network card has it got in there? You say it's got a 10 gig network card. They say, oh yeah, the web server can handle 10 gig. You say, no, it can't. It's impossible, it can't. But you're speaking to application guys that don't understand networking, so they'll actually give you a very approximate answer. So when it comes to actually configuring DOS on any firewall, not just the FortiGate, having the correct information to actually put in the configuration is a challenge in itself. So what the FortiDDoS does is it can run in two modes. It can run in what we refer to as detection mode, and it can run in prevention mode. Now in detection mode, it won't actually drop any traffic. It'll actually learn what's on the network, okay? And it will convert what it's learned into recommended thresholds for you. So you can actually then, you can either put no configuration in the FortiDDoS, or you can configure your web servers or your application servers and say, look, these guys need protecting. And what the FortiDDoS can do is just sit there and it'll automatically learn what the normal traffic rates are, what the normal behavior is to that web server, and it'll make that recommendation. When it comes to a firewall, you don't get that recommendation. With the firewall, you actually have to configure it yourself. You have to understand what the application or web server can do. When it comes to the FortiDDoS, it will learn the traffic going through the box, and it will then make that recommendation. It'll say, look, I've seen this traffic, okay? And this is what you actually need to configure. So that's the first key difference. The FortiDDoS will learn, and it will actually then recommend the configuration. The second key difference is when you go over a configured threshold. So when it comes to the FortiGate, when you actually look into, say for example, you put 500 SYNs per second is the maximum this web server can handle, or 500 HTTP gets is the maximum this web server can handle, okay? When it comes to packet 501, it's going to be dropped, okay? Any firewall will actually say, okay, this web server can handle 500 HTTP gets per second. When packet number 501 comes in, I want you to drop it. With the FortiDDoS, what it actually does is it has multiple tables. Okay, it has multiple tables where it'll actually, when it gets to, so even with the FortiDDoS, you say, okay, I only want this web server to be able to handle 500 HTTP gets per second. When it comes to packet 501, it's not necessarily going to drop it straight away. It's actually going to say, okay, is this a known good IP address? Is this a known bad IP address? Let me look to my multiple tables and then make an intelligent decision based on that. Okay? So that's the second difference. The first difference is the FortiDDoS will learn and recommend the configuration. The second difference is the FortiDDoS will actually look to make an intelligent drop decision. Okay? Or you can just leave it in detection mode so it won't drop anything, but it'll actually report you the statistics. And the third difference is the adaptive tracking. So with the firewall, when you actually put your configuration in, it stays fixed until you go and change it again. With the FortiDDoS, you can actually say, I want you to adaptively learn. So if the traffic is going up over a 6-month period, it's naturally going up. I'm acquiring companies, or my internet traffic to my web servers is getting up. Okay, I don't want my engineers to have to log on to the FortiDDoS once every 2 weeks or once every month to work that out. These guys are very busy. You know, I need either the DDoS protection service to automatically adjust, or if it's not going to automatically adjust, I want it to actually realize that the traffic rates have naturally gone up, and I want it to actually then let my engineers know that, listen, you know, this traffic has increased. You need to potentially look to change that configuration on the FortiDDoS. Okay, so they're the three main differences. We learn and we recommend the configuration. We take intelligent drop decisions, and we can be, so for example, with a bank, they say, absolutely not. I don't want anything to be automatically reconfigured on the FortiDDoS, okay? If a change is to be made, I need my admins to know about it. So we can actually then make that adjustment automatically, or we can actually then alert the admins. So everything that I've discussed so far, you know, the DOS protection, the layer 3, the layer 4, the layer 7, the learning, everything that I've talked about all happens on the ASIC. Okay, so for those of you who work with the service providers, you'll know, that one of the biggest fears, not even in the DDoS world, even when you're looking at core routers, is if your core router is saturated, one of the biggest fears that you actually have is not being able to log on to the box. Because the box is a CPU device, it's so busy. If you can't actually log on to the box to actually reconfigure the BGP, or configure a new policy, or do something, to be able to take control of the box again, that can put you in big trouble. So with, like with the internet routers, what they've actually done to protect themselves is all the traffic forwarding is done on an ASIC, but the management, the logging, everything is done with a separate CPU. So all our FortiDDoS appliances work in exactly the same way. Okay? So all our FortiDDoS appliances have all the mitigation actually happens on the ASIC. So we do a lot of performance testing with our boxes every month. And one of the things that we're very proud of is that we can even push the ASIC over the limit. So we know exactly what the ASIC can do. When we actually push it over the limit, so it's starting to drop packets because it can't actually take the level of throughput, we never lose management. So you can manage the box via the CLI or the web GUI. But irrespective of how much DOS traffic you're actually pushing through the DDoS device, you'll never be able to lock yourself out of the management interface, because that's done all in the separate CPU and a separate part of the actual box itself. Okay, all the DDoS protection itself is done on the ASIC. How you guys coping? You okay? Any questions? I can see a few heavy eyelids, but that's okay. I would imagine in a cinema after lunch, the eyelids are going to naturally get heavy. Okay, I'll do what I do at home. Okay, we've got somebody walking out, that's fine. So I'll do what I want. Silence at home normally means yes, so I'll carry on then. Okay, so when it comes to the FortiDDoS, I've kind of given you the marketing, the salesy pitch, what does the box do? What does it look like? What is it? So we don't have a VM for it. It's a physical appliance, and it comes in different models. We can go up to a high level of throughput, which I'll cover. But our DOS solution itself is typically seen as an enterprise solution because we kind of sit on that side of the internet connection. Okay? So what that basically means, so the first thing that a customer, or hopefully the thing that you're thinking about now as well, if you're sitting on that side of the internet connection, if my internet connection is totally saturated, okay, I've got 2 gig internet connection and it's just full of rubbish. Someone's hit me with a large scale DOS, and you guys are sitting on that side of the internet connection, then you're not really going to be that good for me. So that's right, okay, because of where we sit, we can't actually protect against the volumetric attacks. So that's when I was saying, you've got 3 types of DDoS. You've got the cloud-based protection, you've got the layer 7 attacks, and you've got the cloud-based attacks. So ideally, you do need some sort of cloud-based protection in place to prevent the link saturation, okay? But it's not to say service providers don't use us. You may be working with the service provider and say, okay, look, I want to subscribe to your DDoS solution. We do have service providers. In fact, we have a lot of service providers that use our boxes in their cloud as their DDoS system. But one thing you can't do is actually ring Fortinet up and say, listen, I want to subscribe to your cloud-based service, okay? You can speak, you'd speak and work with your service provider, and they actually may be using a FortiDDoS, but you'd never actually ring Fortinet themselves up directly at the moment anyway, and actually say, okay, look, I want to subscribe to your service. So one of the things that I was talking about, like with slow LoRis, being able to bring a web server down with 300 kilobits worth of traffic. So, that's where we actually come in very effective. When it comes to enterprise customers, because as I said, 80% of the attacks that we see, it's a broad number, but roughly 80% of the attacks, effective DDoS attacks, are less than 50 megabits inside. Okay, so normally we don't actually see a customer that has their internet connection totally full and saturated. The normal thing is, okay, the internet levels for our company looks normal, but our web server is under a lot of stress. The web server's falling over, the CPU is very high, the web server's really stressed out. Okay, and that's where you need the protection against the low and slow attack, and that's where the FortiDDoS comes in effective. So we can protect against high volume attacks, but really for us to be effective against the high volume attacks, we need to be on that side, or we need to be working with your ISP and actually protecting in the cloud itself. Okay? So when it comes to actually the positioning of the box, I'll quickly build this up. So, where does the FortiDDoS sit? The FortiDDoS typically sits in front of your firewall. It's an inline device, so we don't have an off-path solution. In regards to BGP termination, we don't do that. We are a pure inline device today. So things like off-path netflow analysis, cloud-based DDoS solutions, etc. We're working on that, but what we do today, we do very well. And we kind of want to build our customer base up on what we do rather than based on feature requests and future features, etc., etc. So the DDoS itself sits in front of the FortiGate, and Fortinet is fortunate enough to have a very large portfolio to actually do the protection against the deeper layers. So one of the things that we get asked a lot is, what about Ssl protection? Okay, so when it comes to SSL, we can work with the SSL traffic rates and understand what the behavior is, but the actual payload itself, because we don't have signatures, we wouldn't be able to protect against a SQL injection embedded in a SSL payload. Okay, why wouldn't we do that? Because you'd have to rely on something called, you'd have to rely on something like the FortiWeb or potentially the Forti database to actually protect at that upper layer. Okay, so the FortiDDoS does protect from layer 3 to layer 7. But at layer 7, we work with HTTP, with SIP, and with DNS. Okay? A lot of our competition actually say, well, we're a DDoS solution, we can offload SSL, etc., etc. But one of the first things that we see in a POC is that gets switched off. Okay? you do need to look inside the traffic all the way up to the high layers, for all the protocols, but you really ideally need the right product in the right place to do that. Okay. When I first started looking after the FortiDDoS solution, it kind of dawned on me that it was a rate-based DDoS system. And I thought, out of all the interesting things that are there in the security world today, you've got SDN, you've got cloud, you've got big data. From a consumer point of view, we've got our watches now, we've got the iWatch, etc. And I thought rate-based DDoS. That sounds like a very boring solution, sounds like a very boring name. But the more I've kind of worked with it, the more I've understood that, yes, at that layer, when you're looking at traffic above the firewall, you're concerned about making sure that the traffic rates going through to your application servers are actually relevant. So one box can be split up into multiple pieces. So the eyelids are getting a bit heavier, so I'll speed up a bit and get to the demo quicker. So across the bottom, those arrows, so as well as actually doing rate-based DDoS, we can do all the things that a security device can do. So we can do stateful inspection, we can do geo-filtering. So we actually subscribe, the FortiDDoS subscribes to the FortiGuard